morning. Great to have you this morning at Bible class. We have been studying in this class Ezra and Nehemiah. We've pulled from our text, our guideline from the Gospel Advocate Companion series. So that is the series we're using this quarter for Ezra and Nehemiah. We talked last week about some of the obstacles and opposition, and we've actually talked about that a couple of weeks, that Nehemiah was encountering as they were trying to rebuild the wall. So we talked about the Jews having to put up with mockery and also threatened violence from the leaders there in Jerusalem who had been there prior to the exiles returning. So they were trying to discourage Nehemiah and the Jews from rebuilding the wall, trying to sidetrack them, trying to get them off task, so to speak. But nothing was working because with Nehemiah's help, he kept coming back, refocusing the people, refocusing on them building the wall. We saw last week in chapter 4, they were getting opposition through ridicule and through anger. Chapter 4, and if you want to be turning to Nehemiah 5 is where we're going to be today. So if you want to turn in your Bibles, Nehemiah 5. But in chapter 4, we looking there at starting verse 1. But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, that he was furious and very indignant, and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he'll break down their stone wall." So they were getting ridiculed by Sanballat, Tobiah, and some of the other leaders there, trying to slow them down, trying to sidetrack them. But do you remember what Nehemiah's response was to this ridicule from last week? How did he respond? Prayed. So with prayer, he was responding to their ridicule. He ignored them, but he came before God in prayer, and that's how he dealt with all this opposition. The other piece of the opposition we saw last week, chapter 4, was they were getting threats and trying to get discouraged from this group. We see in verse 7 in chapter 4, "Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion." And then jumping down to verse 11, "And our adversaries said, 'They will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease.' So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came that they told us 10 times, 'From whatever place you turn, they will be upon us.'" So it wasn't, we don't think literally 10 times, but it was over and over and over again. These Jews that were hearing these threats came to Nehemiah and were telling him, look, this is what they're going to do. So they were very anxious. They couldn't focus on building the wall because of this threat of violence. And you remember we talked last week how with this particular threat of violence, what Nehemiah did to address it, to combat it. There are about 3 or 4 things here. Anybody remember what those were? As before, what was the first thing Nehemiah did? Prayed, okay? What else did he do? Okay, made plans for the people to be protected. So he set guards at the base of the walls. Remember, he set guards to be on the lookout for any threat of violence. You remember he had somebody with a trumpet to blow the trumpet if there was an attack. so that everybody could go to that and shore up that particular point in the wall that was under attack. He told the people, carry your swords. They had people watching while others were building, and the people that were building also were carrying their swords. And they were all being watchful. And so last week, our comparison to us, our application to us, we looked in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul was telling the Ephesians, how do we battle and combat Satan? And we talked about Satan today being very active in threatening us and having some of these things that Nehemiah's time was happening. They were under threat of attack. And we talked about the armor of God in chapter 6 of Ephesians and how we are to be watchful, how we're supposed to be prayerful, how we're supposed to use God's word as combating Satan in our day-to-day lives. Today, though, we're going to look in chapter 5, another type of opposition that the people in Nehemiah's time had, and that's opposition by selfishness. So when their enemies exhausted all other means, they basically turned to these economic measures to put pressure on those who were building the wall. And this injustice that Nehemiah faced in chapter 5 and the immorality that crept back into the lives of the Jewish people, read more about in chapter 13. But, these things, this falling away from God was probably sanctioned by these enemies that they were dealing with day in, day out. So they were encouraged, the enemies were encouraging them basically to implode on themselves so they could not finish the wall, get sidetracked from their project. But some of them, the Jews themselves, really became friends and allies of the people of the land. They're termed the people that were there before the exile people came back. They became perhaps friends and allies of Sanballat, Tobiah, and their companions. But the record is brief, but this economic turmoil that being faced by Nehemiah and his contemporaries possibly came through this combined influence of the Jews who thought themselves to be wealthy and a combination of those Jews and the people of the land as they were trying to complete the wall. We're starting to see this internal turmoil from within. And kind of see this as an example of a perpetual problem with cultures and organized society, how the reward of industry, of working hard, of doing what you're supposed to do on one end, while on the other side enabling the poor to feed themselves or give their children a reasonable benefit from their hard work. It doesn't always work that way. You've heard the old adage, the poor become poorer and the rich become richer. So in this case, while the wall was being built around Jerusalem, this age-old problem is rearing its head for Nehemiah's time. So some of the people that came to Jerusalem with Nehemiah were wealthier than others. So in the years that passed since Zerubbabel and Jeshua came back, and some of these people that returned were growing prosperous, they were gaining resources, and once people have that economic power and gather those goods and that wealth, people are extremely reluctant to give it up. And we see in this text, in this time, the poor people, they're not unable to feed or clothe or house themselves. And their contemporaries basically were exploiting them. So they became really desperate. And as Nehemiah was looking at the power that he was seeing, there are four types of power that came together in this time as he was trying to deal with this issue. First of all, there is political power. Think of political power being the power of armies and taxation. Second, there was economic power, where those with possessions and wealth have a degree of economic power. Third was the numbers power, just the power of the crowds, number of votes somebody might have. And then fourth, there was religious power, and the power of goodness and justice. So all four of these elements of power enter together in one single seamless group of, they interact with each other, they are entwined with each other, and these combinations can be very subtle in how they interact with each other. Issues and all these types of power are important, and we ought to be thankful for those people willing to do that and do it in a godly way. So let's read chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. That's where we're going to start. So verse 1, "And there was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brethren. For there were those who said, 'We, our sons and our daughters, are many. Therefore let us get grain that we may eat and live.' There were also some who said, 'We have mortgaged our lands and vineyards and houses, that we might buy grain because of the famine.' There were also those who said, 'We have borrowed money for the king's tax on our lands and vineyards. Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children, and indeed we are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have been brought into slavery. It is not in our power to redeem them, for other men have our lands and vineyards." So Nehemiah started to get this outcry from the people. They were really in a bad way. This outcry came from both the husbands and the wives, and they were outcrying really against their Jewish brethren. All those who worked to rebuild the wall and around Jerusalem, they shared together in this common humanity. And we talked about the people having a mind to work. They were united. But as we see that the wives as well, the husbands, they started joining these complaint. It really emphasizes how pervasive this problem was that they were bringing before Nehemiah. Hunger and nakedness exacted as much pain on the poor as from the rich. So the poor came with a complaint. They came with the power of numbers on their side. So they said, "We, our sons and our daughters," they said, "are many. Therefore get us grain that we may eat and live." So in the past, the mockery and the opposition they had before fell on deaf ears. The threat of violence that they encountered, they counteracted with Nehemiah's instructions. But this hunger, this is really going to get attention, because Nehemiah really had been too busy with the wall, perhaps, to notice what was going on around him and happening to the laborers who were building the wall. So the situation had become really desperate. And hardly had Nehemiah heard this first complaint of starving folks, then another group came in and asked for an audience. And they had begun with lands and vineyards. Well, they ended up having to mortgage them to buy grain for their families, to keep their families alive. This famine had struck Jerusalem and the area. And in verse 3, we see where the famine is mentioned. But about the time of Zerubbabel, God had sent a judicial famine, so to speak, upon the land. And we read about that in Haggai chapter 1. For it seemed the people were more intent on building their own houses for themselves than on rebuilding the house of the Lord. So Haggai chapter 1, starting verse 9, it says, "You looked for much, and lo, it has come to little, because of mine house that is waste, and ye run, every man unto his own house. Therefore heaven over you is stayed from dew, and the earth is stayed from her fruit. And I called for a drought upon the land, and upon the mountains, and upon the corn, and upon the new wine, and upon the oil, and upon that which the ground brought forth, and upon men, and upon cattle, and upon all the labor of the lands, of the hands." So that famine that was spoken of in Haggai may have been continued, or its effects could have been still felt, but More than likely, this could even be a different famine, a new famine, owing to showing that how many people that there were now in the land, and they were unable to be supported by the land. So the people told Nehemiah, if they refused to sell or mortgage their land, that they and their families would starve. Others came and said that they had to mortgage their land in order to pay their taxes. Verse 4 says where they had borrowed money. Verse 4 could be reading, we have borrowed money for the king's tribute on our lands and vineyards. So they had a tax to pay for the Persian king in token for their subjection to him, and though it's not likely that it was very heavy, they still were unable to pay it. And the penalty for non-payment included confiscation or death. And you remember, out of some of that, we stated in this earlier lesson, that tribute that they were paying was directed for supporting the building of the wall earlier, for the building of the temple. So some of this, but it was just too much for the people to pay at this point. So remember when Nehemiah had called on his workmen to spend the night as they worked on the wall, working around the clock, or carrying a shield and a sword along with their tools, the people responded favorably. They gave their very best for the project. So now what was Nehemiah to do? He himself was a wealthy man. Was he going to decide in favor of the wealthy people of the Jews with his friends, or was he going to stand up for the poor? So this complaint of the poor is very powerful complaint. In verse 5, they said, "Yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren, our children as their children," they said. So circumstances were a little different 100 years after this, after Nehemiah, when Malachi was God's messenger, and he was prophet. In chapter 3 of Malachi, the people said, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us? Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem." So going back then for Nehemiah, some of the poor who had spoken to Nehemiah had to sell their children even into slavery to survive. In verse 5, "We are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves," they said. So the law of Moses permitted parents to sell their children in times of extreme necessity. So, this for the poor would not have been that uncommon when they've exhausted all other means of repaying debt for survival. So, one of the things that the Jews are told were not to be severe in treating those who had been enslaved, and the Jews could not enslave one another, but in this situation they were considered as paid servants, not as true slaves. But they were reminded in Leviticus 25 to treat their servants favorably, not to be harsh on them. So the instructions in Deuteronomy 15, a Hebrew slave or paid servant was to serve no more than 7 years unless he chose permanent slavery or permanent servitude. So Nehemiah showed himself to be a man of courage and compassion. He sided with those who were powerless, who couldn't, they were poor, they couldn't really hardly survive. So God had found, kind of going back, God had found Israel poor and weak when they were slaves in Egypt. And yet the Israelites knew what it was like to be enslaved. So they had just come back from their captivity in Babylon. So they remembered how it was to be enslaved. Let's go to verse 6. Let's read verses 6 through 13. "And I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, Each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called a great assembly against them. And I said to them, According to our ability, we have redeemed our Jewish brethren who were sold to the nations. Now, indeed, will you even sell your brethren? Or should they be sold to us? Then they were silenced and found nothing to say. Then I said, What are you doing? What you are doing is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies? I also, with my brethren and my servants, am lending them money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Restore now to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, also 100th of the money and the grain, the new wine and the oil that you have charged them. So they said, We will restore it, and will require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Then I called the priest and required an oath from them that they would do according to his promise. Then I shook out the folds of my garment and said, So may God shake out each man from his house and from his property who does not perform this promise. Even thus may he be shaken out and emptied. And all the assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. Then the people did according to this promise. So after Nehemiah had heard this complaint from the poor that came before him, he became very angry. Verse 6, he heard their outcry and their words. First of all, he reasoned with those who were at fault, the nobles and the rulers. In verse 7, after serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and rulers and said to them, Each of you is exacting usury from his brother. So I called great assembly against them. So in today's verbiage, usury is a term that means excessive interest upon money loaned, either formally illegal or at least very oppressive. So in the scriptures, it doesn't necessarily have that sense, but it simply meant interest of any kind upon money. The Jews were forbidden by law of Moses to take interest from their brethren, but they were permitted to take interest from foreigners. But this prohibition grew out of an agricultural status of the people, in which ordinary business loans, they really were not needed at the time, and loans as just required should be made only to friends and brothers in need. But this practice of mortgaging land, sometimes an exorbitant interest, grew up among the Jews while they were in captivity, while they were in exile, but it wasn't a direct violation of the law. So this was doubly cruel at this time, as they have returned now from exile. They were just returning from the land of their captivity, and they were suffering from this effects of the famine that was taking place. And some think that about this time was the time of sabbatical year, when their land must have lain rest without cultivation, and during which time they were expressly commanded not to exact any debt. So this is one of those, some people think they're coming up on perhaps that 7th year when servants were allowed to be freed, to have their debt paid, for the land to lay at rest. But those things might have entered into what's going on here, when the people had mortgaged themselves so heavily with debt they couldn't pay the interest even. But this was a great burden on the people. But the wealthy people here who have created all this situation, they were initially really reluctant to admit any wrongdoing. So Nehemiah called a great assembly of the people. Nehemiah reminded them that they had all come to Jerusalem in the first place to redeem their brothers and sisters from the oppression of the pagan people. So they had been redeemed. They came from exile to Jerusalem, and he and his friends had contributed even funds necessary to redeem their brothers and sisters from the hands of the foreigners. Nehemiah was telling them. Now he asked in disbelief, verse 8, will you even sell your brethren or should they be sold to us? So the nobles and rulers really didn't have any kind of response. They didn't know what to say because they were shamed. They were very ashamed when they realized what they had been doing, and silence was the only response they had. So in previous lessons, the Jews, we talked about, had this renewed dedication and following to the law of Moses. And really when they realized how that they were working against the law, how ashamed they were of their actions, and just ashamed of their greed in just trying to gain more wealth and more money. So this greed and the selfishness really created another internal opposition to this building project, the building of the wall. Verse 9 says, "Then I said, Nehemiah, what are you doing? It is not good. Should you not walk in the fear of our God because of the reproach of the nations, our enemies?" So Nehemiah is telling the people, if you wish to credit that religion you profess, it comes from God of justice and mercy, but should you not in the sight of the heathen abstain from this injustice and cruelty? Can they credit your profession of faith when they see such practices? So even today, we see this inconsistent conduct, perhaps, of people around us, where they say one thing, they say they profess something, and yet they don't follow it. And in this case, it's that greed and selfishness that we see the people in Nehemiah's time. But even today, we can see how much harm that can do when we're professing one thing, and yet we're showing in our day-to-day lives something totally different that goes against it. So those whose power was in their wealth, they used this excessive usury until the poor could not even afford to pay the interest on it. But still, Nehemiah, he was unwilling to just simply cancel debts, to simply just make them all go away. So he and his friends, Nehemiah said, had agreed to lend their poor countrymen the money and grain they needed to pay off their debts. And they charged no interest, since the law of Moses didn't allow for that. And for those who use usury to take possession of the lands, basically foreclosing on the lands and the houses and orchards, Nehemiah required full restitution. So all that had to go back to the previous owners. And it says, in addition, they were to restore 100th part of any money and produce that they loaned to the poor. So 100th part, in this case, some think that's basically a percentage. In some versions, it says a percentage to be returned to the debtors. And that could have been some of the percentage of interest that the debtors were required to pay each month to those who had loaned the money. But some people speculate they assigned a percentage to it, maybe 12% interest. I don't know exactly how. There was some way that they came up with that, but some of the commentaries said they were charging up to 12% interest on their loans. And you think about that and how that compounded and how poor the people were to start with. There's no way that the people could repay that, but they were required to return that to the people as well. So the wealthy agreed to those terms that Nehemiah had suggested. It's likely they didn't really have a choice about it. They realized they were in the wrong. They realized they had broken the law of Moses. But still, Nehemiah was suspicious about their agreeing to this. So he had the rulers and the nobles who participated in all this crisis to take an oath. So that oath was then recorded by the priest to the effect that they would fulfill their promises. Any comments before we go on the next section? Yes.
Going back to building the wall where they had weapons, I listened to a gospel preacher, I guess about 3 months ago from Nigeria, said that they went to church, they carried their weapons, because the religion would kill them.
We are very fortunate not to be under threat of physical harm, aren't we? So where was it Nigeria where this person had been? Just talking about how, as a Christian, they were having to defend themselves and be prepared with weapons going to and from church just because of the threat of physical violence. So we are very fortunate today to be able not to have to do that. So, today's society and culture, we see more and more on the news just this violence that is not, it's just meaningless and just a real waste. And more and more can be religiously motivated. So we are very fortunate at this point in our culture as Christians to be able to come and worship without having that threat of violence against us personally. Let's look at verse 14. We'll start verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people, and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on his people. Remember me, O God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. So this section is labeled in a couple of places about Nehemiah's generosity. So it talks about his being a governor, and it appears in Ezra and Nehemiah this term is used loosely. It can be singular, plural forms within both books. But by the time of this chapter and verse, it looks like the cupbearer of the king, Nehemiah, had gotten the king's blessing to come to rebuild the wall, and he had clearly been appointed to be the governor of Judah by the emperor. So he exercised this authority for a time of about 12 years, it says, by the time he was writing this. And part of the reign of Artaxerxes may have been as a co-regent, but his father, we've talked about this in previous lessons, was Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, as the Greeks knew him. He was the husband of Esther. So as governor, really the Persian emperor gave Nehemiah a great deal of power, and he made provision for Nehemiah to have all the resources he needed at his disposal while he was governor. Still, neither Nehemiah or his close associates used these resources to supply their own personal needs. It says, I believe, verse 14 and 15, and from what is related here, we find that really the table of the governor was always supplied by the people with bread and wine, and besides, they had 40 shekels per day for their other expenses. So the people were greatly oppressed by the servants and officers of the governor. But during these 12 years that Nehemiah was governor, he did not take that salary. He ate none of their bread. None of his servants were permitted to take or exact anything from them. So having such an example is really scandalous for these other chiefs and priests and nobles with the money that they had been confronted on. It was really scandalous for them to oppress the afflicted and distressed people. And it mentions that even before Nehemiah had become governor, we suspect that Sanballat, he could have held that office. And that could account for all the opposition that Sanballat was leading. for Nehemiah is for that group to come back. So they're losing their source of wealth, we should say. But before Nehemiah then came to this area of the province beyond the river, so that would have included Judah and Jerusalem. So it's suspected that Sanballat had exercised this lordship over all of it. We talked about Tobiah, and his area could have been a separate area on the other side of the Jordan River. But at any rate, these previous governors had used Jerusalem to supply their own table and their personal expenses while they were governors. So Nehemiah might have been a man of some personal wealth already. He did not draw on this wealth, as he says, of the Persian emperor as well. So at the same time, Nehemiah was setting a very bountiful table. His Jewish appointees, their personal assistants, they regularly dined with him, as well as surrounding nations were sending ambassadors whom he fed and entertained. And then he did not take the opportunity, says, to buy land. The assumption there is at a deflated or discounted value. You imagine a situation where the governor is asking to buy your land at a really cheap price. You really didn't have much choice but to do it. But he was saying that he had not done that. He made a point also of not profiting personally from being governor. His only thought was that God take notice of his generosity. He gave all his energies to the rebuilding of the city. So Jerusalem was a place where really God had chosen to put his name on it. It was the city of the temple, the priesthood, the feasts, and the offerings. So behind, we see these good works in Nehemiah. Behind these good works, most good works that we see even today, stands an individual. Before Nehemiah, that Jewish community in Jerusalem, it was really floundering. This has been years in the project of building. Remember, initially they built the altar, and then they built the temple, and then now they're working on the wall and the rest of the city. And you remember all those times it was just floundering. They'd stop and start and stop and start, and they'd run into opposition. So Nehemiah had an important position with Emperor Artaxerxes, and he learned of this deplorable condition that was going on in Jerusalem, under which the brethren lived in the city. And at considerable personal risk, Nehemiah was determined to do his best to make the city a place of worship, service to God, the kind of place that Moses had envisioned, a place that it had been when Solomon was there, when Solomon was king. He had built the big, beautiful Solomon's temple. And we're seeing here God, no doubt, was working in the hearts of the emperor, and God blessed the efforts of Nehemiah. He gathered his people, the equipment, the money to travel this long distance to Judah, and he helped his brothers and sisters in Jerusalem. It really became a vibrant city again under his leadership. Anybody have other comments this morning? We see in this last verse of the chapter, this opportunity to put on your thinking hats. We see in this last verse, Nehemiah prayed that the Lord God would remember him. And what was it he was praying that the Lord would remember him for? And how can this really be applied to us today? Read that verse 19. Chapter 5:19. He wanted to be remembered for what? Good. Okay. Wasn't that hard? You wanted to be remembered for good. So he wanted to be remembered for good according to all that he had done for the people. So today, what do we want to be remembered for? If we go to God in prayer, what are we going to request our lives to be remembered for? There's no right answer here. Doing good, okay?
Being a good parent, you know.
Good parent, okay?
Having the heart of a servant.
Heart of a servant, good. You know, Nehemiah could have been, it seemed he had some wealth coming in, and yet he was willing to share that wealth, and he was willing to help other people. I'd like to be known for helping others, helping other people in whatever their need is, helping those who are poor. Anybody else? Bringing others to Christ, bringing others to bringing the gospel to others, and bringing others to Christ. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Okay, we're going to wrap up here today. Thank you so much for your comments. Hopefully we can learn some of these lessons from Nehemiah on how he was dedicated to following God's commands, how he was dedicated to helping those who were in need, who were poor, who couldn't help themselves, and really sticking to God's word, reminding people, in particular the wealthy people, of what God's law was to help others and that they were currently abusing. But so we will always want to remember, God has told us in the Bible how we were to live our lives, how we're to treat other people. So we always want to remember that in our day-to-day lives. So thank you for your attention and your comments today.